I think we've kind of trained ourselves in a way, and I think a lot of structures train us this way in
Hmm.
terms of not saying our authentic yes and not saying our authentic no. This gets back into we haven't been trained how to set boundaries, right? So a lot of us have
Right.
lost touch with that,
We're all
right? We
people
lose touch with it
pleasers.
totally, full on, right? And we're rewarded for that,
Yes.
right? We're rewarded for that in our system.
Hey, Woodrie, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks so much, Shannon. Happy to be here.
Likewise. So, listeners just heard your brief introduction, but just say hello and introduce yourself in your own terms, please.
Yeah, thanks, Shannon. So my name is Woodrie Burich, and I'm an executive and leadership coach, and I focus on supporting individuals and teams within organizations in setting healthy boundaries and then dealing with the tensions and the healthy tensions that arise out of that space.
I am so excited to talk about this because I love this topic. I love this topic because so many of us get this so wrong or struggle so much with the idea of boundaries and confrontation and everything that comes along with that. So I'm so stoked to talk about this. What do you define though, Woodrie, as boundaries in your terms? Because there's a lot of different interpretations of what that means.
Yeah, such a great question. So I think in order to have an honest conversation about boundaries, we have to first define what a limit is. We have to
Yes.
both define limits and boundaries. So a limit is really, if you look this up on Merriam-Webster or something like that, right? A limit's that point at which we can't go beyond. There's all sorts of limits. There's physical limits, mental limits, emotional limits, right? So there's nothing right or wrong about limits. They just are. They're just there. Now, the boundary is what actually we create around that limit. So the boundary marks the area around a limit for us. And getting in touch with and understanding what our personal limits are help us to set and define those boundaries out of it. One thing that I've often found over the years is that all limits actually point us to some sort of value. I value my health. I value my emotional sanity, right? And my mental health. I value this. I have my limits around that. And then setting my boundaries is what helps me protect and support those limits.
I love that. Can you give an example of a limit and a boundary in the context of, let's say, a business owner?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll give a personal one. So let's say that I've had a really tough work day. Well, actually, we could do a personal limit. Let me go this way instead. This is where my mind's going. So let's say I have a client and my client is maybe, since you're a CPA, right? My client's pushing me on deadlines and they're not giving me the information that I need in
Yeah.
order to get my job done, right?
Never had that
And
happen before.
never, right? And the tendency, right, because we have all of these other things like fiscal stability and we have all these professional goals and everything like that, the tendency is to say something like, oh, well, I'll just let it slide this one time. 6 months later, they repeat the same thing. 1 year later, and all of a sudden you kind of have a problem client versus that conversation to say, this isn't really working for me. That's that internal validation piece. And then the external vocalization of that validation internally of, hey, you know what? In order for us to work together, in order for this relationship to really thrive, I'm going to need to make sure that we have these based on these deadlines and or this is the outcome.
Yeah.
An example.
I love that. So specifically, so I understand the difference between limit and boundary. In that example, what's the limit? What's the boundary?
Yeah. So the limit, for example, would be, let's say that as a result of my client getting information to me late, I'm having to stay up late and I'm pushing my team last minute and they're having to stay up late on Friday, or you guys know the April 15th deadlines, right?
Hmm.
So, all of a sudden everything's pushed and everything's pushed to that max. That limit for my team is the overwork. That
Hmm.
limit for the team is, for myself, is that massive push on the back end. And the boundary out of that is, hey, I need this, or we're going to have to redefine this relationship,
Hmm.
or there's going to have to be more payment on the back end, or there's going to have to do this, right?
Yeah. So it's really your terms
Yeah.
around how you work or why or what you do is creating boundaries around that. And I actually I recently did an episode. You guys know that I talked about my core values and how I came up with them. And I actually went in kind of the reverse order. I said, what will make me fire a client? Or why have I fired clients? Or why have I been so unhappy to work for people? And then when I actually unwound the emotion and said, what triggered that? I kind of dove back into, you're right, it all kind of anchors to a value point. And you realize what the limit is, what your value is associated with that, and then what boundary you have to have in place to protect that limit. Is that kind of
Yes.
what you're saying?
Yes, exactly. And the closer we can get to defining that, the easier it becomes to set our boundaries.
Totally.
Yeah.
What do you think? Why do you think it's so hard to set and honestly enforce boundaries? I think setting boundaries conceptually is interesting, fun, and thought provoking. Enforcing them is very difficult. Why do you think there's such difficulty in enforcing our boundaries?
Yeah. There's two reasons personally. My experience in working with clients, what I see is two things. One is the root reality of fear, right? There is fear tied to me setting a boundary that honors what my needs are and honors the needs of the situation, right? There's fear, there's fiscal stability, there's professional reputation, there's where I want to grow, all of those things that are very real. And we can't ignore that aspect, especially working in certain structures that we work in. So there's that aspect. The other aspect that I see is just classic habitual behavior, right? And permission. There's a permission piece that I find with boundaries. For example, if I'm going to start honoring my needs, or if I'm going to start honoring, say, being done at work at a certain hour because I'm used to being a workaholic or something like that. That was my story, right? I would go, 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 go. So if I was going to start honoring and being done with work, say at 5 or 6 o'clock at night, every single night consistently, there needs to be a permission piece in that. I allow myself, or I grant myself permission. And as leaders, also granting that for our teams, preemptively granting that permission. That's a big piece, and it ties to the guilt that oftentimes is kind of hidden behind the scenes on the boundary side of the house.
And as people develop and define their own boundaries, because I think they have them, they just have to put words to them or put them in place or really just like I say, enforce or just really draw them in their life and create them. How can we create boundaries before they are crossed? Meaning it's really difficult to know what your boundaries are until they are pushed or until you've hit a limit or until you've felt some type of pain point or sting from it. At least in my experience, that's how I've kind of learned my limits, right? We talk about that in the form of drinking in college, like learn your limits, like, but you won't learn your limit until you go over it. What are your tips on how to define those boundaries, minimizing suffering?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the reason why we cross those boundaries and we hit our limits all the time is because the vast majority of us have never been taught how to set boundaries. I know when I first started looking at this for myself, I first started getting into this work, not because I had it all figured out, but because I desperately needed boundaries in my life. And I was running a mile a minute and I was hitting my limit time and time again, right? So we are constantly, I think, around us, right? We don't have a lot of role models who are living successful professional lives who are implementing a lot of strong, healthy work boundaries. We don't have a lot of great role models for that. Everyone that I see, oftentimes is working 55, 60, 65-hour plus work weeks, right? So if we don't have models, and then we've never been taught how to set boundaries. I never took that in any of my undergraduate or graduate classes,
No,
right? I
neither
never
did
was
I.
taught, right? Exactly. And so then it's all trial and error. We're all doing this by trial and error. And so of course we're going to hit our limits first. Of course we're going to hit those time and time again. And then to your point, right, Shannon, we have to deal with the aftermath of that. And that's usually pretty painful. It's risky and it's painful. So the way we approach boundary setting is we follow a very simple model. It's energy plus choice equals power. Another way I like to look at it is self-care plus awareness equals boundaries. Self-care has gotten such a bad rap lately, but I think it's because we're missing what it's really pointing us to, which
Yeah.
is it's managing our energy levels. So how do we manage those energy levels? If my energy levels are strong, and if I have very, very strong awareness of my internal situation and my external environment,
Mm-hmm.
then all of a sudden, when those two things are together, my ability to set boundaries is very crystal clear in that moment.
I totally get that. And it's such a struggle too, like you said, culturally And conditionally, I grew up in public accounting as a career where not only were the 55, 60-hour weeks minimum required of you and expected of you, but you wore a badge of honor if you were working 80-hour weeks and you were seen as successful. So it actually turns the whole reward system on its head and makes you go, I am successful when I am busy. And the more yeses I say, the more ahead I will get. And it's so strange to shift into the frame of entrepreneurship where the more no's I say, the more successful I am. And what a mindset set shift that you have to undergo to get there. Can you kind of expand on that, what you've seen with clients or with yourself, kind of making those types of shifts?
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that. It's like the yes, no. I love to play with the yes, no world, right? So every single time we say yes to something, we're saying no to something. And every single time I say no to something, I'm saying yes to something else. And I love playing with that world, and it gets back into defining those values and defining those limits. One of my favorite exercises you were talking about, kind of clearing the whiteboard at the beginning or clearing the board when you first
Mm-hmm.
kind of started off, right?
Yeah.
I have this exercise that I use every single month, and you can see it. I could show it to you right here on my wall. I have a whiteboard, and every single month I wipe it clean. Because as an
Mm.
entrepreneur, what I find is my strategic goals, while there's a thread and a line through them, they shift, and I need to be able to adapt with that. And learning what those yeses and nos are a lot of times has to do with how connected am I to what I need, right? And as entrepreneurs, we can lose sight of that very, very rapidly because we have all the minutia of everything that we're doing day to day, as well as all of the client needs, as well as leading a team, as well as, right? It just keeps going. So
Mm-hmm.
for me, carving out and creating strategic thinking time in the day is really a primary key for learning how to set boundaries. Because when I carve out that strategic time for myself to grab a cup of coffee, to grab a cup of tea, and some quiet, some downtime, it allows my mind to move where it needs to go. And it'll also really show me if maybe I'm missing something, maybe I'm going too fast, and maybe I kind of have like this little bit of anxiety or a little bit of anxiousness going in the background, and I can connect in with that. That's a really good place to play and make sure that we're committing to that regular strategic thinking time, or strategic downtime, as I like to call it, to just check in with ourselves. It's a big piece.
I totally agree. And I think that some people find that in the form of, say, journaling. Some people go for a walk. And I think just being alone with yourself and being able to think is insanely powerful, especially as a business owner. When I was telling you before we hit record that, when I was in my corporate job, and this is what Woodrie's referring to with the whiteboard, was when I was in my corporate job, I was constantly at the mercy of everyone else's time booking my calendar, sometimes triple booking me. Sometimes the same person was double booked, invited me to both their meetings, and someone else invited me to another one. So yes, the yeses and nos were rampant because literally accept and decline all day long. And I had to make these choices. And then eventually, when I quit my job, I wiped out my calendar clean and I said, what do I want? When am I at my best? Like, what should I be doing when I'm at my best? What should I be doing when I'm a little bit more tired? When do I want to exercise and move my body? How can I install pockets of time for myself for once in this calendar? And I just took a step back and I was like, this is the greatest moment of my life when I can take back control. And so, as if somebody is struggling right now with, maybe they are still working that 9 to 5, or maybe they are an entrepreneur, but they're in that season of yeses because they just want to be uncovering opportunities. They're playing that minesweeper game, hoping it's an opportunity when they say yes and not something that will, not an obligation. So what tips do you have for someone who's maybe struggling with defining what their boundaries are, or just approaching burnout and doesn't know what to do?
Yeah. Well, I think, the first piece, if we go back to the model, I always go
Mm-hmm.
back to the model because it's always solid for me, is if we look at that first piece, we always start with the self-care energy piece. And like I said,
Yep.
there's a lot of bad rap out there right now over self-care. And I actually push back against it because I think it's vital.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the personal power piece. right? If I'm connecting to myself, I need to bring in energy in order for me to change my situation. Because as we know, right, when we look at our workloads and we look at all the tasks, I can't begin to fix those if I don't have the energy to look at the situation. I need energy in order to shift what's going on. So that first piece that I always look to is, how am I carving out that strategic time? And when we're moving a mile a minute, it can be very hard to get 30 minutes of time. That feels like a luxury, right? Maybe it's 5 or
Totally.
10 minutes here or there, right? Maybe it's just something very, very simple. And really committing and holding that is sacred space for ourselves, right? Is really what we do. We hold that and we claim it. I find a lot of times, right, we'll go and we'll always be the last thing on the burner, right? We'll be the last burner on. It's always everything else goes first.
Yep.
And I think as entrepreneurs, it's really vital that we shift that to where we have to be front and center, because everything we touch comes out of us, right?
I totally agree.
We have to shift that. And it's also, if you're in a job, even if you're not an entrepreneur, right? You know, I ran my company and I was in corporate space at the same time, running a tandem. It doesn't matter. Everything we touch comes out of us.
Mm-hmm.
So until we connect to that space and claim that, I always tell people there's no good time, right? There's no time where all of a sudden it's going to miraculously occur that I have time for myself, right?
Yeah.
That doesn't happen. We have to choose a moment where we're like, you know what, I'm going to prioritize me and I'm going to commit to that and consistently come back to it, and then find support around you to do so. Because that's a big piece too. Finding the people who can model that and who can honor you in that process.
I love that. I absolutely love that. And I'll shout out, when you mentioned that, I'm going to shout out Courtney, who's my operations administrator in my company, who purposefully will put time in my calendar when she thinks I'm getting stressed out. And she goes, no one's going to meet with you tomorrow. Or she blocks off my mornings once a month to just do deep work and focus work. When she sees that there's a lot of meetings on the calendar, she will go in and go claim my time back. And I couldn't ask for a more valuable skill in a person to work with me than to identify those and to help me out. So shout out to her for that. And that's one thing. Ask your team members to do that. Ask them to go in and say, hey, if there is white space or if there is anything in there, an hour here or there. I actually do that every Sunday. So this is my little time hack, is every Sunday I go, or maybe Monday morning, I go, whoever has booked me has booked me. Everyone else is too late. So we are now going to install. Now, again, I install pockets of time for myself already and have certain boundaries around types of meetings. But what I also do is any unbooked time, I fill in with intentional activities and goals for the week. So this is when I'm going to work on this. This is when I'm going to work on that. And it brings me so much peace to know I have time carved out for everything I have to get done. I don't have to work late nights, and I'm realistic about what I can accomplish this week without feeling disappointed. And I think that a lot of us who are like hustlers tend to overestimate what we can get done in the week and then just set ourselves up for disappointment.
Yeah, so solid, Shannon.
Yeah.
First off, I love the Courtney, going back to your comment, love the Courtney sets that time aside for you. Well
Yes.
done. And then, yes, you know, it is very challenging. I also think that one thing I think can be really, really supportive for us when we look at boundary work and we look at workload specifically, and we look at prioritizing things, is sometimes we have to say no, right? Sometimes we have to, which can be very scary. It gets back into the fear piece, right? It can be very scary to say no, especially when we have everything on that list. But what I tell people to look for is look at the trend line. What's your trend line? If your trend line is you're always working those 60, 65-hour weeks and there's no end in sight, that's a structure issue. Something's broken in the structure. If I'm required to work those kinds of hours, either I have to accept that I'm always going to do that and so be it, right? Or I have to recognize something's broken in that structure and I need to reshift that. And then we go back to the model, which is carving out time and space so that I can cultivate a little bit of energy for myself so that I can apply that energy to reflect on what's really going on here. Am I saying yes to too many clients? Am I accepting clients who are bringing in information or difficulties on the back end for us? Like, or is something broken in my in how we manage work? Could I offload more work over here? Or what am I saying yes to? What am I saying no to? And really looking at those priorities.
And I think it's not necessarily, this is how I would phrase it. It's not necessarily saying no more, but it's making your yeses conditional for yourself and for the other person. So it's like a yes, but, or a yes, and, or it's saying yes, but then equally committing time for yourself so that you have the energy and fill your cup to be able to deliver on that yes. So it's a bit of both. It's not less yeses. It's conditional yeses.
Yeah, I love that. And what I would also say too is that, I think we've kind of trained ourselves in a way, and I think a lot of structures train us this way in terms of not saying our authentic yes and not saying our authentic no. This gets back into, we haven't been trained how to set boundaries, right? So a lot of us have lost touch with that.
We're all
We
people
lose touch with
pleasers.
it. Totally, full on, right? And we're rewarded for that.
Yes.
Right? We're rewarded for that in our system. So what happens is when we hit those limits, it's painful, and then we have to reflect on that. So when we look at that and we see it from a big picture perspective, we need to really unwind and unpack some of the mindsets and belief structures that get us there. And that takes energy and it takes time. And it is so valuable, because what is unleashed when I start setting those boundaries is creative space, right? When I start setting that time, I shift my business outcomes dramatically, because I am committing to myself and I'm really revisioning where and how I want to go. Now, going back to this concept of saying yes and saying no, I think we've kind of trained ourselves to say yes when we mean no, because we're not in touch with that. But the other thing too, I oftentimes say, is we need to look at, whenever we set boundaries, I think there's this really big piece we're missing oftentimes, where it's mutual respect. We've lost this piece of mutual respect. Somehow we've learned that by sacrificing self for other, that's always good. And that is a healthy choice if I'm coming from a whole place in myself. I can sacrifice myself in a moment when I'm feeling whole and good and I want to be generous. Continual sacrifice of myself when I'm feeling depleted, that's not healthy for either relationship, right? Because it's just not truth. So learning and really starting to see mutual respect with both parties and learning how to articulate that and finding that and really holding that, I think is a big piece in terms of redefining our work relationships.
I absolutely love that. And we talked about like being a people pleaser or being rewarded for the yeses that deplete us, right? But I think that there's this conception, how do I want to phrase this? Like this perception that if you say no, that's a confrontation, or that is going to cause a conflict. So as we kind of learn the basics of boundaries and we enforce our boundaries, how do we navigate around tension or conflict that comes up in that process? Because I think that is where a lot of the fear is, that people just don't want to engage in conflict because they don't want to create resistance.
Yeah, great. So first, I think there's acknowledgement that there will be tension. There will be moments where it's not comfortable, right? When we work with boundaries in boundary spaces, it's not comfy spaces, not all the time. Sometimes it feels great. There's like some initial relief, like, oh, I'm setting my boundary and I'm going to give myself a little bit more energy, but then comes the hard work, right? Which is why the energy is so vital, and why that continual support of self is so vital for us to set our boundaries and consistently come and meet them. So when it comes to connecting with and dealing with that tension, one, the recognition that it's going to arise, but then two, it's the continual care and feeding of understanding what we need, right? Like if I'm not in touch with what I need, I'm not going to be able to articulate that or vocalize that. When we're running so fast and we're on these hamster wheels, right? I'm not in touch with what's going on with me. I'm disconnected most of the time from my body. And I joke all the time, like for me, it was always, I was on the third cup of coffee and I was like, I got this, I got this, I got this. And then all of a sudden it's 7:00 at night again, right? But my mind has overridden my body completely. And I'm like, I got this. Meanwhile, my neck's bugging me, right? So there's this interplay, I think this reclaiming of ourselves that has to occur, which is why I'm so adamant that self-care cannot be thrown out, because that is the strengthening of ourselves in order to give us the strength, in order to really connect in and vocalize that no. The other thing I've learned over the years is that if I hit a limit and then I set my boundary, or if I'm hitting my limit and I'm setting my boundary in that moment, it's going to come out a lot harsher, right? Because I'm at my limit. But if I've learned and I'm taking that strategic downtime, or I'm taking that time for myself and I'm learning how to integrate that within my workday, I can have that conversation and say, hey, look, this is just how it is, right? I can have that conversation with clients, say, hey, I've noticed the last 3 times that when we asked you to get this out to us on XYZ date, that you were about 2 or 3 weeks late, and we had to ping you about 3 or 4 times. And that's just not really going to work for our team. That's a different conversation than, oh my gosh, I'm so frustrated with this client and I'm going to get on the phone and let them know right now. Right?
Exactly. And I've done both.
Yeah. Yep.
More of the former than the latter, luckily, but because we know it's coming. Because I think once you've had that one instance, in my case, like when I've had that one instance where I was like, I can't do this anymore, then I immediately turned to my team and said, how do we prevent this from happening again? And that's where all the decisions were made. And that's where the process started to build the communication framework around the first communication. Was, how do I identify that this is the path we're going down? And before we hit that like road sign where the road ends, I go, how do we find a place to turn around or stop the mission and say, this isn't going to work out? And before all of us get hurt, let's just call it what it is and leave amicably. One of the best skills I've ever learned, because it saves so much energy, so much stress, so many relationships when you can say, hey, I'm recognizing a pattern here and I just don't think this is a good fit anymore. And when you can do it in a matter of fact way, and I'll use this example, right? Firing a client. Some of the best skills I've learned from my coaches have been, thank you for the opportunity to serve you, and just saying that this is no longer a fit. But the other thing that we do is we don't give elaborate reasons as to why, because then we're inviting conflict. We're inviting, all that conversation and inviting more energy draining. And we just say, hey, we've acknowledged that this is probably not a fit for us anymore. And sometimes I feel like people over assume that they owe explanations and explanations and explanations for the no. Like they'll bury a no in excuses, or they'll bury a decline or bad news. And it just convolutes the whole communication, where people are like, so are you firing me? Are we breaking up? Like, I can't tell what's going on here, because you won't get to the point. Yeah. What are some of your advices or pieces of advice on communication when you want to enforce your boundaries, but you're hesitant and you just keep going and going and going and elaborating,
Yeah, so good. So 2 pieces. One is the mindset piece.
Yep.
There's usually guilt wrapped into that.
Yes.
And if there's a little bit of guilt in there, what that means is that the validation process internally hasn't been completed here. So there are times, and I always caveat this, there are times where we need a very clear binary boundary. Yes, no. Right. And those are situations where if I'm in a toxic work environment, or if I'm dealing with an abusive kind of toxic work situation, I need to have a very clear yes or no. And if I can't set that for myself, I need to get professional help to do so. Right. But then we have these other scenarios, which is what you're talking about, kind of like this scenario where it's like the nuanced no is what I call it. Right.
Yeah.
Like these kind of like, I don't really like this. I have to say no because I'm saying yes to protecting my team. Yes. I have to say no because I'm protecting the longevity of where we're going. And I want to say yes to the clients that feed us and make us happy, and that we can really serve in a deeper way. Right. So there's my no and there's my yes. That is a validation process. That validation happens here. It's through that strategic time. It's through that downtime where we're thinking and we're giving ourselves the opportunity to kind of connect inward first. And then once we validate that vocalization, it comes a lot faster and a lot easier. And we're really sure. I find that guilt happens a lot of times when we're wishy-washy. That's how it shows up for me. I'm wishy-washy because I haven't made my internal decision. When I validate it here, it comes out crystal clear there. And then on the other side, so that's the mindset piece. And then if you look at it from a tactile perspective, like a strategic perspective, my favorite approach is what we call rehearsed responses. I think everyone should have these rehearsed responses for themselves, these go-to phrases that get us out of a meeting or get us out of a moment where we're like, hey, this isn't comfortable for me. I love I statements. I really love I statements. Hey, I would really like to be able to focus on this right now, and I can't pay attention because I'm focused on this. When would you like to connect on this? right? Very I statement, or, hey, I've noticed that, like we were doing before, right? Hey, I've noticed that we're late on this. This is not working for our team in order to serve you the way that we want to and the value that we want to provide our clients. Either we need to address this in this way or this manner, or it's really time for us to part ways.
Yeah. And we're unable to provide you the value that you expect from us if we can't achieve this together, right? So there's a lot of this kind of, we're part of the team and we need you to step up as part of the team without really insulting anybody.
Yeah, absolutely.
I love that. So, when it comes to, let's say there is conflict. Let's say you're facing a lot of resistance or a lot of maybe defensive behavior. Maybe your client or your other person on the other side of this conversation doesn't have the mindset, maturity, and perceptions that we're talking about here, that they're not at that place. And maybe they're getting defensive. Maybe they are lashing back, or they're, making you question those boundaries again, or telling you you're being too demanding or a diva or whatever, right? By trying to enforce your boundaries. What are some of your tips to deal with that resistance and conflict? I mean, when you can't prevent it, there's only so much you can do. You want to get the optimal outcome that you can, but it's not within your control to get that optimal outcome with everyone leaving peacefully. Sometimes you're going to go through conflict and all you can do is minimize the damage.
Yeah.
So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, well, I really love this notion of getting curious and getting clear. Right? Get curious, get clear. Those are my phrases that I go to. If I'm in a scenario where the person that I'm working with is perhaps confused, or maybe just having a challenge understanding what I'm trying to articulate or understanding what my boundary is, well, then I can get really curious, right? Then if there's no rudeness going on, or if there's no pushback, right? If there's maybe a little bit of defensiveness, I can still get curious and I can say, so what I'm saying is this, I'm hearing that you're maybe not connecting with this. How do you feel about what I'm articulating here? How do you feel about this relationship as we move forward, kind of thing, right? This working relationship. Or what are your expectations? What are your goals? My goals are to XYZ, right? And so you can ask some questions around that, which might open up lines of communication on the back end. Alternatively, if you're dealing with someone, it's kind of like the whole concept of some people are just challenging, and we know those individuals, right? Yeah. Some individuals we're not going to change, and we have to work with them in some situations, right? Some situations we don't have a choice. For a while, I would say always for a while. Sometimes we don't have a choice in that moment, and that too is a choice, right? I'm choosing to work with this person for a while until this shifts. So in those scenarios, I think it gets really, really important for us to get really clear on what we need. It's that validation so that we can vocalize. And it's all about I statements, and it's all about what's okay with us and what's not okay with us. And I'll give a very simple example here. I was working in an organization years ago, and there was this one supervisor, which was, I would say, pretty challenging. And this individual was known to be fairly challenging. And I had worked with this individual. I got a phone call late at night and hey, can you please fix this? Can you please fix this? And the first time I was like, yeah, no problem. I can do that. Second time, as soon as I returned it, it was an immediate phone call back. And this was back and forth on a Friday at like 7 o'clock until 9 o'clock.
I've been here so many times.
Right. And I got to the point where I was like, oh, this is a boundary issue, right? Like this is very clearly just an issue, right? And I have to find a way to be done with it. And I finally was like, hey, thank you for that. I'll be able to get to this on Monday. Right. Now I had the ability, I was in a position of power to some degree. This person was above me, but I had some authority. I knew that I would be backed up by doing so with my team around
enough
me.
Leverage to say that with a backing. Yeah.
Correct. And I think that that's where we get into nuances, right? In the work worlds. It's not always easy. Boundaries are not always easy. There's not always that clean line or clean path through. It's a process, which is why the energy is needed, and the introspection and the choice is needed, as well as the external awareness.
Yeah. And I can back up to say especially someone who came from public accounting, workhorse lifestyle, 100%, like traveling all the time. Key example, I was called at Friday at 8 p.m. on my bereavement leave with a question about work that was definitely not unique to me answering it. Could have been, it was literally something like how to work something in Excel. Like it was a very non-specific item. And I remember I dropped an F-bomb for the first time on that partner on that phone call because it was like my dad who had passed away. It was like my dad's spirit came out of me. And I was like, are you effing serious right now? Because I picked up the phone and I'm like, someone else must have died because what is going on? So I pick up the phone and I was like, wow, that was a defining moment for me when I went, you know what? I got to take care of myself because no one else is going to be keeping me in mind. No one else is going to be protecting my own boundaries. No one else is going to say, hey, I shouldn't call Shannon, even though they want to. Because in this day and age, I can go, hey, S word, because if I do it, she'll say something on my phone. I can tell her to call anyone at a moment's notice without being mindful of where they are, what they're doing, or what their preference is right now. And we're also kind of in that hustle mode where we're not thinking and we're not being mindful of each other. And we can't expect other people to be mindful of our own boundaries. So I think it's so powerful to adopt a skill set in your own boundaries so that you can protect them yourself in a healthy way without being difficult. And I think that there is a way to do that very tactfully.
Yeah. Great example. Sorry that happened. And not that
It was
normal,
the greatest
right?
thing to happen because I left
Yeah.
with very much clarity. I left that company with much clarity. Yeah.
So good from that perspective. And it's not abnormal, and Bridget Schulte, who I love, if you haven't checked her work out, she wrote the book Overwhelmed and is a New York Times bestselling author and also runs a podcast called Better Life Lab. And she talks a lot about tunneling and busyness. And you're hitting on this piece, which is we're all moving so fast, so very quickly that it's really hard to be mindful of our needs, let alone the needs of people around us. And
Yeah.
I think that this really, I talk a lot about how I feel like we are at this edge, this precipice of effort. We know effort well. We have gotten through that. We know how to push teams. We know how to push ourselves. We have maxed out the benefit we can get from effort. What we have not figured out how to do yet, collectively, individually, within corporations, is how to step into ease and all the benefits that provides us. Right? And all the research points to this, the creativity, the innovation, the strategic thinking, all the strategic problem solving that comes out of that. All of these skills are something that arise, and these benefits arise when we start wiping that whiteboard clean and starting to say, okay, I'm going to own this and I'm going to say no to this. There's massive power that comes out of that space. And not only for ourselves personally, but also within our professional lives. It's a win-win. And the moment more individuals recognize this and organizations recognize this, and they start to actually reap those rewards on the back end, to your point, right? That clarity that came through, that recognition of this is okay, this is not okay anymore, right? Like I'm going to put myself in charge. I'm going to put myself in the driver's seat of where I'm going here. All sorts of doors open.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Woodrie, I could talk about this with you pretty much all day. But I know we have to put a bow on this for our listeners who are done with their shower, their workout, or their cleaning right now. So what piece of advice would you like to leave behind for our listeners, to carry with them as they listen to the show?
Yeah, I think the big piece for me over the years is boundaries can be hard. They can feel very scary at first, especially if I'm setting it in a space that is difficult or with difficult, challenging conversations, right? And recognizing that I do have the tools to do this. I can absolutely do this, and I can absolutely find the support people around me, such as the Courtneys of the world, to create these islands of oasis to support us as we collectively change our structures and our work structures. It's time.
Love it. Love it. How can folks find out more about you and what you do? And do you have anything to share with our listeners?
Yeah, thanks. So I'm pretty easy to find. There's not very many Woodries out there in the world. So, but you can find us at integratingwork.com. And we have a really great private Facebook group where it's just a great group where we have videos and we do guides and we give giveaways and things along those lines. It's called Boundaries Before Burnout. Would love to see you there. And you can follow us. I'd love to have followers and connections on LinkedIn and Facebook and all that fun stuff.
Awesome. Make sure you check out Woodrie and her work. It's amazing. And this is something that we definitely need to be talking more about and sort of normalizing in our society, the idea of boundaries in a healthy way. So thank you, Woodrie, for sharing all your wisdom with us today.
Thanks so much, Shannon.